April 18, 1945. The skies over rural Czechoslovakia erupted with anti-aircraft fire as a crippled B-24 Liberator, trailing black smoke from its No. 3 engine, carved a desperate arc through the morning clouds. Inside the fuselage, Sergeant William Kessler gripped his radio equipment with white knuckles, his headset crackling with static and the panicked voices of his crew. The bomber had been returning from a raid on German fuel depots when a burst of flak tore through the aircraft's belly, severing hydraulic lines and igniting an oil fire that now threatened to consume the entire plane. The pilot's voice cut through the chaos with 3 words that sent ice through every man's veins: "Prepare to bail out." But Kessler knew what awaited American airmen in this corner of Czechoslovakia in the war's final weeks. The SS was retreating eastward, desperate and vicious, executing anyone who might slow their withdrawal. Czech villages that harbored Allied airmen were being burned to the ground, their populations massacred as warnings. As Kessler's boots hit Czechoslovakian soil after a harrowing parachute descent, his first thought wasn't relief at surviving the jump. It was the certainty that he had perhaps 30 minutes to live before a German patrol found him. He had no idea that his survival would depend on sharing a pitch-black basement with the last person on Earth he ever expected to meet, or that the next 6 weeks would challenge everything he thought he knew about enemies and allies, about hatred and humanity, about the neat categories that war creates and the messy reality that exists beneath them. William Kessler had grown up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the son of a steel worker who had fought in the trenches of World War I. His father had returned from France with lungs scarred by mustard gas, and a conviction that the Germans were a fundamentally brutal people who understood only force. Young William had absorbed these lessons at the dinner table, where his father's coughing fits punctuated stories of German atrocities in Belgium and France. When William enlisted in 1943 at age 20, he did so with a clear moral framework. America and her allies represented civilization and decency, while Nazi Germany embodied pure evil. The men he would bomb from 30,000 feet were not individuals with stories and families. They were the enemy, period. This certainty had sustained him through 32 combat missions over occupied Europe. It had helped him sleep after raids that killed hundreds, perhaps thousands of people he would never see. It was the psychological armor that every bomber crewman needed to function. But that armor was about to be stripped away in the most unexpected circumstances imaginable. Kessler hit the ground hard in a plowed field about 2 miles from the burning wreckage of his B-24. He could see the black column of smoke rising in the distance and knew it would draw German patrols like flies to carrion. His ankle screamed with pain as he gathered his parachute, but he couldn't tell if it was broken or merely sprained. Either way, he needed to move. He limped toward a tree line, his service pistol drawn, every sense hyper-alert for the sound of vehicles or voices. The Czechoslovakian countryside was deceptively peaceful in the spring morning light. Fruit trees were beginning to blossom. Birds sang. It seemed impossible that this pastoral landscape was about to become his execution ground. He had made it perhaps half a mile into a small forest when he heard the snap of a branch behind him. Kessler spun, raising his pistol, and found himself face to face with a man in civilian clothes, middle-aged, with a weathered face and intelligent eyes. The man raised his hand slowly, speaking in accented but clear English. "Do not shoot, American. I am Joseph. I am here to help you. But we must move very quickly. The SS are already searching." Kessler's training screamed at him to be suspicious. German intelligence was known to use English-speaking agents to capture downed airmen, but something in Joseph's eyes, a kind of weary urgency, convinced him. What choice did he have anyway? His ankle was swelling rapidly. He couldn't outrun a patrol. Joseph led him deeper into the woods, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every trail and hiding spot. As they walked, Joseph explained in quick, quiet sentences that he was part of a local resistance cell that had been helping downed Allied airmen escape to Soviet lines. But the situation had become much more dangerous in recent weeks. The Germans were in full retreat, but also in full panic, executing anyone suspected of partisan activity. Just 3 days ago, they had hanged 5 people in the next village for hiding a British pilot. The escape routes to the east were compromised. The Soviets were advancing, but they were still perhaps 40 or 50 kilometers away. For now, Joseph said, Kessler would need to hide. There was a place. It was not ideal, Joseph admitted with what might have been dark humor, but it was the safest option they had. They were going to hide him beneath the village brewery. They reached the outskirts of a small village as the sun climbed higher. Joseph made Kessler wait in a drainage ditch while he scouted ahead, then signaled him forward in short sprints between buildings. The village appeared almost deserted. A few old women watched from windows but quickly looked away, their faces carefully blank. Everyone knew the cost of being seen helping an American. They reached a sturdy stone building with a faded sign that Kessler couldn't read but which Joseph identified as the brewery. It had been in his family for 3 generations, Joseph said with quiet pride, though the Germans had requisitioned most of their production. Joseph led him around to a back entrance, through a storage room filled with empty barrels, and then to what appeared to be a solid stone floor. But Joseph knelt and worked his fingers into an almost invisible seam, lifting a heavy trapdoor that revealed a ladder descending into darkness. Down, Joseph urged, quickly. Kessler descended into a blackness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The air was cool and smelled of earth and old beer. His boots found a dirt floor. He heard Joseph descending behind him, then the scrape of the trapdoor closing, sealing them in absolute darkness. Joseph struck a match, and in its brief flare, Kessler saw they were in a small basement, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a low ceiling that forced him to stoop. There were a few crates, some blankets, and in the corner, something that made Kessler's heart stop. A man, another person was already down here. In the match's dying light, Kessler saw a pale face, dark hair, and most shocking of all, the unmistakable field gray uniform of the Wehrmacht. His hand went instinctively to his pistol, but Joseph grabbed his wrist. Wait, Joseph said urgently. Listen to me. This is Klaus. He is a deserter. He has been here for 8 days. The SS are hunting him as eagerly as they hunt you. You will both stay here until the Soviets arrive. You will both be silent. You will both survive or you will both die. Those are the only options. The match went out, plunging them back into darkness. Kessler stood frozen, his mind reeling. He was supposed to hide for weeks in a space barely larger than a prison cell with a German soldier. Every instinct screamed that this was insane, that the German would kill him the first chance he got, or betray him to his former comrades. But Joseph's hand was still on his wrist, and Joseph's voice was steady in the darkness. I know what I am asking, but Klaus has already had 8 days to betray this location. He has not. He wants to live. You want to live. That is enough for now. Over the following hours, as Kessler's eyes adjusted to the near-total darkness broken only by thin cracks of light from the trapdoor above, he began to make out more details of his prison and his unlikely cellmate. Klaus sat against the far wall, his left leg wrapped in blood-stained bandages. He was young, Kessler realized, probably not even 25. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and something else, something that looked like profound guilt or grief. They did not speak that first day. Joseph brought them food after dark, lowering a basket on a rope, bread, cheese, some kind of sausage, and a jug of water. He also brought strict instructions. During the day, they were to remain absolutely silent. German patrols came through the village regularly, and the Gestapo had been conducting house-to-house searches. Any sound, any indication that someone was hiding beneath the brewery would mean death not just for them but for Joseph and his entire family. At night they could speak, but only in whispers. Joseph would visit when he could, but they should expect long periods alone. He wished them luck, and then the trapdoor closed again, and they were left in the darkness with each other. The first 3 days were a study in mutual distrust and barely contained hostility. Kessler and Klaus maintained their positions on opposite sides of the basement, as far apart as the cramped space allowed. They moved as little as possible, aware that any sound might carry upward through the floorboards. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of the village above, muffled voices, the occasional rumble of vehicles, once the sharp crack of gunfire that made both men freeze in terror. Kessler found himself studying Klaus in the dim light, trying to reconcile this exhausted, frightened young man with the image of the enemy he had carried for 2 years. Klaus seemed to be doing the same, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Kessler with an expression that was hard to read. Fear, certainly, but also something like curiosity. On the 3rd night after Joseph had brought their meager rations and departed, Klaus finally spoke. His English was heavily accented but comprehensible. "You are wondering why I am here. Why I deserted." Kessler said nothing, but Klaus continued anyway, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will tell you because we may die here together, and I think you should know. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am only explaining." Klaus had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1942, he said, at age 19. He was from a small town in Bavaria, the son of a schoolteacher who had quietly opposed the Nazi Party but lacked the courage to resist openly. Klaus had been assigned to an infantry unit and sent to the Eastern Front. What he described over the next hour, in halting, pain-filled whispers, was a descent into a moral abyss that Kessler, despite all his father's stories, had never fully imagined. Klaus spoke of the systematic brutality of the war in the East, of villages burned, of civilians executed for suspected partisan activity, of orders that made no military sense but were designed purely to terrorize. He spoke of a specific incident in Poland in the winter of 1944 that had broken something fundamental inside him. His unit had been ordered to clear a village suspected of harboring resistance fighters. They had found no fighters, only families. The officer in command had ordered the execution of every male over the age of 12. Klaus had refused. He had been beaten, threatened with court-martial, but another soldier had intervened, and in the chaos of the retreat westward, the incident had been forgotten. But Klaus had not forgotten. He had begun looking for an opportunity to desert, to simply walk away from the machinery of atrocity he had become part of. That opportunity had come 3 weeks ago when his unit was retreating through Czechoslovakia. During a nighttime march, he had simply slipped away into the darkness. A Czech farmer had found him, half-starved and delirious with fever from an infected wound, and had brought him to Joseph. Kessler listened to this confession in the darkness, his emotions a chaotic mix of skepticism, disgust, and something uncomfortably close to sympathy. How could he trust anything this German said? This could all be a lie, a manipulation. And even if it was true, did it excuse anything? Klaus had worn the uniform. He had been part of the machine. The fact that he had eventually refused one order didn't erase his complicity in everything that came before. But there was something in Klaus's voice, a raw self-loathing that was hard to fake. And there was the undeniable fact that Klaus was here, in this hole, hunted by his former comrades, having thrown away any chance of survival within the German military structure. Kessler finally spoke, his own voice rough from days of silence. "You're telling me this because you want me to understand you're not like the others, but you were like the others, for years." Klaus was quiet for a long moment, then replied, "Yes. I was. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only asking you to understand that some of us woke up. Too late, yes, but we woke up. And now we are here in this hole and we have only each other. That is the truth of our situation." The days blurred together in the darkness. Time became almost meaningless in the basement, marked only by Joseph's irregular visits with food and whispered news of the outside world. The war was ending, Joseph told them. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, but the SS units in Czechoslovakia were still fighting, still executing anyone they perceived as an enemy. The Soviets were advancing, but slowly, consolidating their control village by village. It might be another week, maybe two, before they reached this area. Kessler and Klaus would need to wait to endure. The physical hardships were considerable. The basement was damp and cold. Both men's wounds, Kessler's ankle and Klaus's leg, healed slowly in the unsanitary conditions. They had a bucket for waste that Joseph emptied during his night visits, but the smell was inescapable. They slept fitfully on thin blankets spread over the dirt floor. But the psychological strain was even worse. The enforced silence during daylight hours, sometimes lasting 12 or 14 hours, was maddening. They could hear life continuing above them, footsteps, conversations, and occasionally the terrifying sound of German voices as patrols entered the brewery. During these moments, both men would freeze, barely breathing, their eyes locked on each other in the darkness, united in absolute terror that a cough, a shifted position, any sound at all would betray them. It was during the long nights when they could whisper to each other that something unexpected began to develop. Not friendship exactly. The gulf between them was too vast for that, the history too heavy. But a kind of understanding, perhaps even a reluctant respect. They began to share stories of their lives before the war. Kessler talked about Pittsburgh, about working in his uncle's garage, about his dreams of becoming an engineer. Klaus described his childhood in Bavaria, his love of music, his father's extensive library that had opened worlds to him. They discovered they were both the same age, 23. They had both wanted to go to university before the war consumed those plans. They argued, sometimes heatedly but always in whispers, about responsibility and guilt. Kessler challenged Klaus. How could you not have known what you were part of? How could any German claim ignorance of the camps, the murders, the systematic evil of the regime? Klaus didn't defend the indefensible, but he tried to explain the psychology of it, how totalitarianism works by fragmenting reality, by making each person responsible for only a small piece of the machine, so that no one feels responsible for the whole. How propaganda and fear combine to make people suppress their own moral instincts. How he had been a coward for years before he finally found the courage to refuse. Kessler found himself thinking about his own moral certainties, the neat categories he had used to organize the world. He had dropped bombs on German cities from 30,000 feet, never seeing the faces of the people below, never knowing whether his bombs hit military targets or apartment buildings full of families. He had told himself it was necessary, that it was war, that the Germans had started it. All of that was true, but was it the whole truth? Was there a meaningful moral difference between dropping bombs from a distance and pulling a trigger up close? He didn't know anymore. The darkness of the basement seemed to seep into his certainties, making everything more complicated, more ambiguous. Klaus asked him once, "Do you hate me?" Kessler considered the question seriously before answering. "I hate what you were part of. I hate what your country did. But you, sitting here in this hole, having given up everything to not be part of it anymore. I don't know what I feel about you. It's not hate. Maybe it's something like pity, or maybe it's recognition. We're both just trying to survive." Klaus nodded slowly in the darkness. "That is more than I expected. Thank you for your honesty." On the 15th day of their confinement, they heard a commotion above that was different from the usual village sounds. Shouting, running footsteps, the unmistakable sound of vehicles, multiple vehicles, arriving in the village square. Then gunfire, sustained bursts that made the floorboards above them vibrate. Both men pressed themselves against the dirt floor, hearts hammering. This was it. The Gestapo had finally come. Someone had betrayed them, or Joseph, or perhaps the SS, was simply conducting one final massacre before retreating. They heard heavy boots entering the brewery, German voices shouting orders. The trapdoor above them was directly beneath a stack of barrels. If the Germans moved those barrels, if they discovered the hidden entrance, it was over. Kessler and Klaus looked at each other in the thin light filtering through the floorboards. Without speaking, they reached across the space between them and gripped each other's hands. Two men who should have been enemies, united in the certainty that they were about to die together. The boots moved around above them for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. There was a crash as something was overturned, more shouting. Then, gradually, the sounds receded. The vehicles started up again. The gunfire stopped. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence, heavy with dread and unanswered questions. Joseph did not come that night, or the next night. By the third day, without food or water, Kessler and Klaus were in serious trouble. The water jug was empty. They had eaten the last of their bread 2 days ago. Dehydration was setting in, bringing with it confusion and weakness. They barely spoke, conserving energy. Kessler found himself drifting in and out of consciousness, his mind wandering to memories of home, of his mother's kitchen, of cold water from the tap. He hallucinated that he was back in his B-24, that the mission was just beginning, that he could still change the outcome. Klaus was in worse shape, his infected leg wound having worsened without fresh bandages. He muttered in German, sometimes calling for his mother. On the 4th day, Kessler made a decision. They couldn't wait any longer. If Joseph was dead, if the resistance cell had been destroyed, they would die down here in the darkness and no one would ever know. He whispered to Klaus, "We have to try to get out. We have to open the trapdoor." Klaus, barely conscious, nodded weakly. Kessler gathered what strength he had left and climbed the ladder. He pushed against the trapdoor. It didn't budge. He pushed harder. Nothing. Something was on top of it, something heavy. They were trapped. Kessler descended the ladder, his last reserves of hope draining away. He sat next to Klaus in the darkness and thought about the absurdity of it all. He had survived 32 bombing missions over Germany. He had survived his plane being shot down. He had survived landing in enemy territory. And now he was going to die of thirst in a basement, inches away from freedom, alongside a German deserter who had become the closest thing to a friend he had in this God-forsaken country. He thought about his father, about how he would never know what happened to his son. He thought about all the things he would never do, never see. He must have lost consciousness because the next thing he knew, there was light, blinding light pouring down from above. The trapdoor was open. A silhouette was descending the ladder. Kessler tried to raise his pistol, but his arm wouldn't respond. A voice, speaking in accented English, American, German, "You are alive." It was not Joseph. It was a Soviet soldier, a young lieutenant with a red star on his cap, staring at the two men in the basement with undisguised amazement. Behind him, more Soviet soldiers were gathering, looking down into the hole, talking rapidly in Russian. The Soviets pulled them out of the basement into a world that had been transformed. The village was now occupied by Red Army troops. There were Soviet flags hanging from buildings. German prisoners were being marched through the streets under guard. Joseph was alive, it turned out. He had been arrested by the Gestapo during that raid 2 weeks ago, along with several other resistance members. But the SS had retreated before they could carry out the executions, and the Soviets had liberated them. Joseph had immediately told the Soviet commander about the two men hidden beneath his brewery. The Soviets had moved the barrels and opened the trapdoor, expecting to find corpses. Instead, they found two barely alive men who represented a complicated problem. An American airman was straightforward. He was an ally. He would be turned over to American forces, but a German deserter, that was more complex. The Soviets had their own scores to settle with the Wehrmacht. The lieutenant questioned Klaus extensively, with Joseph translating. Klaus told his story about his desertion, about his refusal to participate in atrocities. The Soviet officer listened with an expression that revealed nothing. Kessler, receiving medical treatment from a Soviet medic, watched this interrogation with growing anxiety. He realized that Klaus's fate was being decided right now, and it didn't look good. The Soviet lieutenant seemed skeptical of Klaus's story. Why should they believe a German deserter? How many Soviets had Klaus killed before his convenient crisis of conscience? Klaus had no good answers to these questions. He sat with his head bowed, accepting whatever judgment was coming. Kessler found himself standing up, his legs shaky, and approaching the Soviet officer. He spoke slowly, hoping Joseph could translate accurately. "This man saved my life. We were in that basement together for weeks. He could have betrayed me to the Germans at any time. He didn't. He's telling the truth about deserting. I'm asking you to show him mercy." The Soviet lieutenant looked at Kessler with surprise and something like respect. "You would speak for a German? After what they did to your country, to my country?" Kessler met his gaze. "I'm speaking for this German, for Klaus. He's not innocent, but he's not the enemy anymore either. He made a choice. It cost him everything. That should count for something." The Soviet officer considered this for a long moment, then spoke to Joseph in Czech. Joseph translated. "He says that Klaus will be held as a prisoner of war, but he will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. He will not be executed. He will eventually be repatriated to Germany when the war is fully over." It was the best outcome Klaus could have hoped for. He looked at Kessler with tears in his eyes and spoke in English. "Thank you. You did not have to do that." Kessler shrugged, uncomfortable with the emotion. "We survived that hole together. That means something." The Soviets separated them shortly after. Kessler was taken to a field hospital, then transferred to American forces advancing from the west. Klaus was taken to a POW camp. They did not see each other again, but Joseph promised to try to get word to each of them about the other's fate. Kessler spent 2 weeks recovering before being sent back to England and eventually home to Pittsburgh. The war in Europe ended officially on May 8, 1945, less than a month after he had parachuted into Czechoslovakia. He had missed the final victory by hiding in a basement with a German deserter, and somehow that seemed fitting. Back in Pittsburgh, Kessler tried to return to normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. The certainties he had carried into the war had been shattered in that dark basement. He found he couldn't talk about his experience with anyone who hadn't been there. How could he explain that he had spent 6 weeks in hiding with a German soldier and had come to see him as a human being, even as something like a friend? How could he explain the moral complexity of it all to his father, who still saw the world in the clear terms of allies and enemies, good and evil? Kessler went to college on the GI Bill, studied engineering as he had always planned. He married, had children, built a career. But he never forgot those weeks in the darkness, or the conversations whispered in the night, or the moment when he and Klaus had gripped each other's hands, certain they were about to die together. In 1963, 18 years after the war ended, Kessler received a letter forwarded through multiple addresses. It was from Klaus, who had survived the Soviet POW camp and returned to Germany. He had become a teacher like his father. He had married. He had 2 daughters. He wanted Kessler to know that he thought of him often, that those weeks in the basement had saved his life in more ways than one. They had given him hope that reconciliation was possible, that the hatreds of war didn't have to be permanent. He hoped that Kessler was well, that he had found peace. Kessler wrote back, and thus began a correspondence that would last for decades. They never met in person again. The logistics were complicated, and perhaps there was a part of both of them that wanted to preserve the memory of those weeks in the basement as something separate from ordinary life, something pure in its intensity. But through their letters, they maintained a connection that defied the categories of war. They were not exactly friends, but they were something deeper than that. They were witnesses to each other's transformation, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, even between sworn enemies, something like understanding could emerge. Kessler never told his father about Klaus. He knew it would be incomprehensible to the old man, who died in 1967, still convinced that every German bore collective guilt for the war. But Kessler told his own children when they were old enough to understand. He told them about the basement, about the fear and the hunger and the long silences. He told them about Klaus, about his desertion and his guilt and his desperate attempt to reclaim his humanity. And he told them about the moment when he had spoken up for Klaus to the Soviet officer, risking nothing really, but doing it anyway because it felt necessary. The story of William Kessler and Klaus, whose last name Kessler never learned and Klaus never offered, is not a typical war story. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of heroism or victory. It's messy and morally ambiguous and uncomfortable. But perhaps that's why it matters. The Second World War was the most clear-cut moral conflict in modern history, a genuine fight against evil. But even in that war, even in that clarity, there were moments like this, moments when enemies discovered their shared humanity, when the categories broke down, when individuals made choices that defied the logic of total war. Joseph, the Czech resistance fighter who risked his life and his family to hide both an American airman and a German deserter, understood something profound about moral courage. It wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was about preserving the possibility of a future where former enemies could live together, where reconciliation was possible. The basement beneath the brewery was a crucible where 3 men from 3 different nations, each with their own wounds and guilts and hopes, created a small space of shared humanity in the midst of apocalyptic violence. Klaus died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. His last letter to Kessler, written in a shaky hand, expressed his hope that the Cold War divisions that had replaced the World War II divisions might also eventually dissolve, that the lessons they had learned in that basement might someday be learned by nations and peoples. Kessler died in 2003 at the age of 81. Among his effects, his children found a small wooden box containing all of Klaus's letters, carefully preserved, along with a faded photograph of a young man in a Wehrmacht uniform that Klaus had sent in one of his early letters. On the back, Klaus had written in English, "This is who I was. Thank you for helping me become someone else." The story raises questions that don't have easy answers. Can individual acts of decency redeem participation in evil? Does desertion from an evil cause constitute heroism, or merely belated recognition of obvious truth? What do we owe to those who were once our enemies, but who have genuinely changed? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are intensely practical questions about how we build a world after conflict, how we move from war to peace, how we create the possibility of reconciliation without betraying the memory of victims or excusing the inexcusable. The basement beneath Joseph's brewery no longer exists. The building was demolished in the 1970s to make way for modern construction. But the story survives, passed down through families, recorded in letters and memoirs, a small footnote in the vast history of World War II. It survives because it tells us something important about the complexity of human nature, about the possibility of change, about the unexpected places where understanding can emerge. It reminds us that even in the midst of the most justified war in modern history, even when fighting against genuine evil, individual human beings remain capable of surprising acts of compassion and moral courage. William Kessler went to war with certainties about who the enemy was. He returned with questions about what it means to be human, about the difference between the individual and the system, about the possibility of redemption. Those questions stayed with him for the rest of his life, shaping how he thought about conflict and peace, about judgment and forgiveness. In the end, perhaps that's the real legacy of those 6 weeks in the darkness. Not a simple story of friendship between enemies, but a complicated story about moral growth, about the painful process of seeing the humanity in those we've been taught to hate. It's a story about 2 young men who should have killed each other, but instead learned to see each other as human beings. And it's a story about the choices we make in extreme circumstances, choices that define who we are and who we might become.